Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're dissecting a truly high-stakes diplomatic tightrope walk with a surprising envoy right at the center of it. And all this is unfolding under the shadow of a looming deadline for, well, what some are calling crushing sanctions. So can these secret signals and, urgent ultimatums actually pave a path to peace in Ukraine? Or are we just watching a kind of geopolitical game of chicken?
Well, our focus today is definitely on that recent visit, U.S. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Whitkoff, heading to Moscow, meeting with Russian President Putin. And like you said, this wasn't just any meeting. It happened right as U.S. President Trump delivered this really firm ultimatum about the conflict and the potential for significant new U.S. sanctions.
Right.
So yeah, we're going to meticulously review the details of this crucial visit, try to unpack the signals exchanged, and, put it all in the broader context of these ongoing multi-party negotiations.
Okay, let's start with the diplomatic dispatch itself then. Steve Whitkoff's visit to Moscow. Now, this was his fifth visit to Russia in a pretty short time frame, right?
That's right, fifth.
His previous 4 meetings with Russian President Putin all happened within just 3 months. The one just before this was April 25th. That feels like an incredibly intense pace for high-level contact.
It really is.
What is that kind of frequent personal diplomacy signal, both to Moscow and maybe to Kyiv, especially with that public ultimatum just hanging there?
Yeah, that frequency is absolutely key. It suggests a very focused, almost you could say personal diplomatic push from U.S. President Trump. For Moscow, it probably signals seriousness, a direct line, maybe even bypassing some of the usual diplomatic channels. For Kyiv, well, it might bring a mix of hope, but maybe also some anxiety, right? I'm wondering what deals might be discussed behind closed doors.
Sure.
It definitely ratchets up the pressure on everyone to show some kind of movement.
Yeah.
And interestingly, U.S. President Trump had announced Whitkoff's travel plans beforehand. Said he'd visit Israel first, then Russia. And on August 1st, Whitkoff was actually in Rafah, in Gaza, talking with families of individuals held by Hamas.
That's a fascinating detail to stop in Gaza. Adds another layer, doesn't it? Maybe a broader humanitarian angle or regional stability focus.
Could be. Highlighting a commitment to global issues, maybe, before diving into the Ukraine conflict specifics.
Yeah. And the Moscow visit itself, it was expected maybe over the weekend, but then got rescheduled to August 6th.
That's right.
So morning of August 6th, Whitkoff arrives in Moscow, Vnukovo Airport.
Yeah.
Met by Kirill Dmitriev.
Yep. Kirill Dmitriev, he's the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund and also a special representative for economic cooperation.
Okay, economic ties. And they went to Zaryadny Park before the Kremlin.
They did. A little walk in the park before the main event.
What's the significance of meeting Dmitriev first and, visiting a park? Seems a bit informal before a Kremlin meeting.
Well, it's all part of the diplomatic dance, isn't it? Dmitriev is a significant figure, often used as a channel for, let's say, informal or sensitive discussions, especially things touching on economics. So meeting him first, the park visit. It suggests an attempt to maybe build some rapport, establish a more relaxed feel before the really serious talks at the Kremlin, kind of softening the ground, so to speak.
Okay, makes sense. And then the meeting itself, Whitkoff and Russian President Putin in the Kremlin, August 6th. Lasted about 3 hours.
Approximately 3 hours, yes. And Dmitriev was also in that meeting.
3 hours? That's substantial. It implies more than just a quick hello.
Definitely suggests substantive discussions took place.
So after those intense 3 hours, behind closed doors, the first bits of info started to, trickle out. Yeah. Let's look at those immediate reactions, the signals. Yuri Ushakov, assistant to the Russian president, he called the conversation very useful and constructive. Sounds positive, but diplomatic language, right?
Absolutely. Always carefully chosen words. Ushakov reported that Russian President Putin had received corresponding signals from U.S. President Trump via Whitkoff. And in return, Russian President Putin apparently conveyed some signals concerning the Ukrainian issue.
Signals. It always sounds so vague.
Well, it does to us, but in high-level diplomacy, these are often, highly choreographed messages delivered through a trusted envoy like Whitkoff. They communicate positions, maybe red lines, potential compromises, but without the stiffness of a formal public statement.
It allows for flexibility, deniability.
Exactly. Crucial and sensitive talks. And receiving corresponding signals implies maybe some mutual understanding on key points, even if full agreement is miles away. Ushakov did say more comprehensive comments would come after Whitkoff had briefed U.S. President Trump.
And U.S. President Trump himself, well, he put out a statement on Truth Social, called the meeting very productive, and claimed great progress was achieved.
Yes, quite definitive sounding.
But like you said, these public statements, strategic signaling maybe, rather than concrete breakthroughs, what's the aim? Managing expectations.
Could be several things. Managing domestic audiences, signaling resolve to allies, maybe putting pressure on the other side. Great progress might just mean keeping the communication lines open, especially with that August 8th deadline getting closer.
Right, the deadline.
U.S. President Trump also mentioned he'd informed some European allies, said there was a consensus among them that the conflict must end, and that efforts would continue in the coming days and weeks, which highlights, a desire to show a united front or at least gather support for his approach.
And then Whitkoff gets back, talks to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Rubio confirmed the call. But Rubio's comments seemed a bit more guarded. He said White House statements were coming and the tone could be positive or maybe not.
Yeah, a bit more cautious.
And he also said the U.S. would decide on sanctions imminently. That caution suggests things are still very much in flux.
It absolutely does. Reflects the internal dynamics, probably, the careful messaging needed, acknowledges the uncertainty and the weight of that sanctions decision. That's a huge leverage point for the U.S. Although a White House official did later confirm the Whitkoff-Putin meeting was seen as positive, and that Russia apparently expressed a desire to keep negotiating with the U.S.
So the dialogue channel stays open. That seems key.
That's the core takeaway, yes. Despite all the pressure and the public talk, the channel is open.
And U.S. President Trump's schedule wasn't affected after the meeting.
Right, suggesting a planned, integrated approach.
And crucially, after Moscow, U.S. President Trump also called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Very important detail. Keeps Kyiv in the loop, maybe reassures them their interests are still being considered, connects those two diplomatic tracks.
Okay, so this whole diplomatic flurry, it's all happening because of this firm ultimatum from U.S. President Trump. Let's dig into that ultimatum, the ticking clock. The deadline, he said, is Friday, August 8th. That's very soon.
Extremely soon. And U.S. President Trump had, previously voiced his dissatisfaction with the lack of progress, threatened new sanctions, tariffs. Initially, he gave Russia a 50-day window for a ceasefire. Then he cut that dramatically down to just 10, 12 days.
Wow, 50 days to 10, 12. That's a serious tightening of the screws.
Underscores the urgency from the U.S. side, absolutely. And yes, those secondary sanctions are expected to hit on August 8th if nothing changes.
And these aren't minor sanctions we're talking about. Back in April, Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Richard Blumenthal, they proposed legislation for crushing sanctions.
That was the word crushing.
Included things like 500% tariffs on Russian goods and secondary duties on products from countries buying Russian oil, gas, uranium.
Right. And U.S. President Trump himself escalated that in July, talking about secondary tariffs around 100% against Russia and its trading partners.
Crushing 500% tariffs. Those really do sound like economic sledgehammers. How does 500% compare to typical sanctions? And what's the real bite of a secondary duty, say, for a country like India?
Yeah, crushing is apt. 500%. Most punitive tariffs are maybe in the 10%, 25% range. 500% basically makes trade impossible, economically speaking, for those Russian goods coming into the U.S.
Just shuts it down.
Pretty much. And secondary duties. That's where the U.S. targets other countries doing big business with Russia, especially in energy. It forces nations into a really tough spot, keep trading with Russia, and face potentially severe U.S. penalties or align with U.S. policy.
A global chokehold, not just squeezing Russia directly.
That's the idea, yeah.
Now, U.S. President Trump acknowledged Russia might be able to get around sanctions somewhat.
He did.
But said the U.S. would impose them anyway. That's an interesting admission. Aware of the challenge, but determined.
It shows a realistic view, maybe, but also signals that unwavering resolve. Sanctions are a tool, right? Even if they're not always a perfect silver bullet.
And the Russian reaction? Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin press secretary.
Peskov basically said the Russian economy has been under a huge number of restrictions for a long time now and has developed a certain immunity.
Immunity? Sounds bold. Is there truth to that?
Well, Russia has built up some resilience. They've pivoted to new markets, built up reserves, like developing antibodies, they've adapted to past shocks.
But 500% tariffs and secondary sanctions?
Yeah.
That's a different level.
Exactly. The sheer scale proposed here is designed to test even that immunity to its absolute limit.
And it's not just theoretical pressure on trading partners.
Yeah.
U.S. President Trump didn't give a final tariff figure for Russia, but he did announce significant extra tariffs against India.
Yes, specifically citing India's purchases of Russian oil and arms.
And then, boom, August 6th, the same day Whitkoff leaves Moscow, U.S. President Trump signs an executive order, 25% duties on Indian goods.
Swift, direct action. A clear message showing follow-through. It demonstrates the U.S. isn't just making threats, they're ready to act, even against a major partner like India.
Right.
India's been doing that balancing act, geopolitically, needing energy, buying discounted Russian oil, keeping military ties. These tariffs are a direct economic hit for that choice.
Definitely underscores the global reach here.
No question.
Okay, so with that sanctions deadline breathing down everyone's neck, let's broaden out a bit. Look at the peace negotiations themselves, beyond just the U.S.-Russia channel.
Good idea.
Before Whitkoff's visit, Russian President Putin commented on talks with Ukraine, said they're always in demand and always important, especially if it's a pursuit of peace. He also called the progress on prisoner exchanges positive, noting hundreds of people returned to their homeland. Sounds like an open door, but what's the actual practical progress?
Well, it's important to separate the general statements from the concrete steps, right? Direct talks between Russia and Ukraine did resume back in May 2025. There have been 3 rounds, May 16th, June 2nd, and July 23rd.
Okay.
And the main practical outcomes so far really have been humanitarian. Like Putin mentioned, exchanges of prisoners, and also exchanging the bodies of deceased soldiers.
Grim but necessary work.
Absolutely. Vladimir Medinsky, who heads the Russian delegation, reported Russia transferred 7,000 bodies, received a small number back, and was ready to transfer another 3,000. It's tangible progress on a deeply painful issue, helps build maybe a fragile bit of trust, even while fighting continues.
And on July 23rd, Russia proposed setting up 3 working groups: political, humanitarian, military issues.
Yes, and they also suggested short, 24, 48-hour truces along the contact line, specifically to retrieve casualties.
Those sound like very practical, sort of de-escalatory steps.
They seem to be, trying to compartmentalize issues, find practical fixes, especially on the humanitarian side. But Ukraine, for its part, is still holding firm on needing a comprehensive ceasefire first and wanting that presidential meeting by the end of August.
Different approaches then.
Very much so. Russian President Putin commented on August 1st, something like, "Disappointments arise from excessive expectations." Said true peace needs substantive conversations, calmly, in the silence of the negotiation process, which, he implied, was why Russia suggested the working groups.
So Ukraine wants the big gestures, the summit, the ceasefire. Russia prefers this quieter, step-by-step working group approach.
That seems to be the dynamic.
But Putin did say the Ukrainian reaction to the working groups was generally positive, and they agreed to negotiate quietly.
He did say that, yes, that both sides agreed to conduct those talks without public fanfare, hoping the process would start. That's potentially a glimmer of hope that they both see a need for some practical path forward, even if the end goals are still far apart.
Wait.
And also, on August 1st, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, he weighed in on the U.S. position, called it responsible. Said the U.S., unlike, his words, aggressive Russophobic Europeans, understands the realities and wants to address the root causes.
Interesting framing there. Trying to split the U.S. from Europe.
Seems like it. And he also laid out Russia's core demands, again, saying progress needs Ukraine to clarify its stance on the Russian language, education, culture, history, memory, even the prohibition of canonical orthodoxy.
So Russia's demands go way beyond just military issues. Deep cultural, historical stuff.
Absolutely. That's central to their narrative.
And how did Ukraine respond? President Zelensky.
Zelensky responded that same day, August 1st. Said Kyiv sees and supports U.S. President Trump's efforts, and he repeated Ukraine's readiness for a leader-level meeting anytime if Russia is genuinely committed to ending the conflict and finding lasting peace.
So Ukraine's door is open for a summit, but the condition is genuine commitment from Russia.
Exactly. They're willing, but need proof of serious intent. The Kremlin, meanwhile, hasn't totally dismissed a summit,
Okay.
but they keep emphasizing it needs thorough preparation first. They mention agreeing on memorandums that were exchanged way back in the second round of talks.
So they want groundwork laid first.
Right. Peskov, the press secretary, said basically that jumping into a high-level meeting without finishing that complex prep work would be hardly expedient.
So back to Russia preferring the incremental steps, avoiding a big summit that might fail if the details aren't ironed out beforehand.
That's the consistent message from Moscow, yeah. Not until the groundwork is done.
Okay, so we've just navigated a really complex web here. Diplomatic maneuvers, Whitkoff's intense Moscow visit, all these statements flying around from Washington, Kyiv, Moscow, all set against this rapidly approaching, very significant sanctions deadline.
Yeah, the ongoing dialogue, those signals being passed back and forth, the public positions from U.S. President Trump, Russian President Putin, Ukrainian President Zelensky, it really shows just how multifaceted these efforts are. And that August 8th deadline for U.S. secondary sanctions, it remains absolutely key. A huge pressure point hanging over all these intricate discussions, as these high-stakes negotiations keep going and the pressure just keeps building. What could be the truly unexpected breakthrough here? Or maybe the unforeseen ripple effect from all these diplomatic chess moves?
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.